I'm going to officially, one more time, introduce Anna Freudenstein. I'm going to say it right one day. Anna, as you know, has been doing a wonderful series for us about extraordinary Jewish women, which we are really enjoying, and we have invited her back, and this is series 2. I think today it's 2.2. I think that's where we are. I think this is the second in our second series. So welcome back, Anna. We're delighted to have you. Today's topic is the daughters of Zelophelad, I think. Yes, I'm trying to do that. Okay, daughters of Zelophelad, real estate and identity. So I'm really interested in where this one's going to go, and I'm going to turn it over to Anna. And as always, please, if you have a question, put it in the chat, and we will have at least 2 breaks. We'll have 2 breaks to answer some of the questions. Don't be shy. If you have a question, please, we would like to hear from you. And then we will unmute you and you can ask your question. Okay, Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Randy. Hi, everybody. Modin l'simcha. That's the special Chag Sameach for these middle days of Pesach. I don't know if you're all in a matzah fog or some other kind of waiting for springtime fog. This is supposed to be the holiday of springtime, and it's not feeling like it today. But hopefully we can cheer up our day and wake ourselves up a little bit. I feel like I need it. Sorry, these chats can be distracting now that we're starting the Zoom this way. Anyway, I might have to hide the chat so I don't see it. Anyway, happy to see all of you and happy to share some words of Torah with you today. I'm going to start with a tiny bit of self-promotion. I hope it's okay. I think that if you're all here, you all know a little bit about social media and you're all interested in extraordinary Jewish women. So what I did last year for myself, because I was starting to go crazy, it was just the beginning, if you remember the old days of the pandemic, and I gave myself a project where we have a special 49 days between Pesach and Shavuot when we count the Omer. And I gave myself a personal project of doing a special Instagram post every single day, and each day highlights something about Jewish women. So I'm kind of reposting them this year. I'm not creating it from scratch. My dream is maybe one day to actually transform it into a book. But for now, I'm reposting them with maybe a little bit of different messages for this year. And so if you want to be reminded what day you're counting the Omer, if you're counting, or if you don't care and you just want to learn about something about Jewish women every day, and you're on Instagram anyway, then search me up. I wrote the message in the chat how to do that. And then you'll have a little information from me on your screen every day also, in addition to hopefully you'll be sharing time with us together on these special Wednesday afternoons. All right, so today we are talking about the daughters of Zelophelad. Now, the daughters of Zelophelad are in the Torah. I have to tell you a little bit about my experience and my knowledge of the daughters of Zelophelad. I am very lucky that I went to Jewish day school my whole life, and even yet, even though we learned a lot of Torah, we certainly didn't learn every single passage in the Torah. I'm also very blessed, and so anyways, I never learned it in school. Okay, that's 13 years of Jewish day school. I'm all the way through grade 13. Then I was a regular shul goer for most of my life. And until I was in my mid-teens, I had never heard this story from hearing it in shul either, because it shows up in the summer months. And so it was only because that was the time to go to the cottage. It was only when I started going to Jewish camp, it was actually Camp Ramah, that I started learning about those stories in the Parshiot and the Torah in the summer. And lo and behold, the story of the daughters of Zelophelad was introduced to me there. So I just wanted to give you that little bit of anecdote about how I started hearing about these women. It's often taught as a very empowering story, and I'm hoping that we will have a lot of empowerment from it. However, just like in real life, things are sometimes a little bit more complex and not necessarily always as rosy, perhaps, as when we tell the story to children. Don't worry, this is still G-rated. This isn't like some of our other stories we've studied, but it gets a little bit more complex, perhaps not as empowering as you might originally think, the way I'm going to present it. But then hopefully I'm still going to turn it around towards the end, and my goal is at least to leave on an uplifting, intellectually honest, but complex, but still very positive light for these very special women in the Torah. All right, there's my intro. And I'm going to go over to the share screen as I like doing so that I have text in front of us. Again, if it's your first time with us and you see lots of words on the screen, don't worry. I'm here to guide us through. All right, and over to the share screen. Just organizing. Present. Lovely. And oh, no, don't want that yet. And I think you guys are seeing a gray box on the corner. That's some of the faces I get to see. Maybe I'll switch that up. All right. Again, any questions, please put them in the chat. And at approximately halfway through, we'll stop and take the questions. And then we'll take questions again at the end. And again, as Randy said, please don't be shy. All right. Daughters of Zelophelad, real estate and identity. Okay, real estate. I'm not going to give you any real estate tips or anything like that. I'm sure there are probably real estate agents with us today. I am not one, but we're going to be talking about the importance of land and land ownership in addition to, actually, it's a key idea of what we'll be discussing. So sometimes I like to start with a classical painting, if one exists, of the biblical episode that we are going to be discussing. I didn't search too hard, but unfortunately I was not able to find one today, as I've heard from many people that I've taught before that they've never heard of the daughters of Zelophelad. I told you my relationship with them and how it took me a long time to learn about them. So I guess they weren't very popular amongst medieval painters who painted, these paintings that we usually enjoy. Perhaps it has to do with the personality, the story of the women too. I'm going to leave that to you to decide on your own by the end of me telling you about it. For now, though, I was able to find this print, which apparently comes from a printed Bible in 1880. One. Not so happy with the positioning, though, of that one daughter. Looking a little bit Jesus-y with her arms outstretched like that. That's just my opinion. That's not part of the story, don't worry. Here we go. We keep talking about daughters. I might have mentioned already there are 5 of them. And here we have their names, okay? We're going to study the story together from the book of Numbers, from Sefer Bamidbar, and I'm going to show it to you in a few minutes, but I thought I'd just introduce the characters to us first. We actually have the names of these women, which we don't always have in the Bible. Sometimes the women in the Bible are not actually named. We just get to hear their father's names, and we learn that they're so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so, or they're so-and-so, the wife of so-and-so. Now we have these women's names. We have them once listed out here, all 5 of them, sisters, and we even have them mentioned a little bit later on in the Bible as well. So it sounds like, well, not a big deal. It's a big deal when it comes to women in the Bible. We know their father's name. So anyway, the daughters' names are Machla, Noah, Hogla, Michla, and Tirzah. And Noah here, of course, being the feminine form, it's spelled differently. It's not like Noah as in Noach, as Noah's Ark. It's Noah, pronounced and spelled differently as a female name. All right, so we have these 5 daughters, and we know what their father's name is and what his larger family's name is from. This is going to become, as we'll see, very important lineage. What his father's name is, etc., all the way back to Manasseh, who was the son of Joseph. We remember the sons of Jacob, of course. We remember Joseph, so a well-known, the one with the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph himself doesn't get a tribe like his other brothers do. He actually gets two tribes. They are named for his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. You'll recognize those names probably also because part of the priestly blessings that parents sometimes give their children when it's to a son, they reference those names, Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay, so Manasseh in English, that's the way it's printed out here. I'm probably going to end up saying in the Hebrew pronunciation. Manasseh is Zelophehad's great grandfather, and it'll become important because it's his tribal affiliation. All right, now I think those of you who have been with me before know my favorite timeline here that I always want to share, so that I remind you of the context of where we're at in biblical, in this case, biblical history. So I know the print is very tiny, but the whole point is here so that we can see all of Jewish history or most of Jewish history on one screen in front of us, so we can get just the context of what comes before, what comes after. So the time period that we're talking about now is here. If you see, oh, I'm sorry, because every time you scroll over something, there's a pop-up, which is fascinating, but a little bit distracting for us right now. So if you see what the period here of of the judges right here between the patriarchs and the judges. So toward the end of the time period of the patriarchs here is the time when the Israelites were in Egypt and came out of Egypt, just as we celebrated earlier this week. And then the 40 years in the desert, and then conquering the land here at the beginning of the judges period and moving in to the land of Israel. So we're talking about here right at the end of the patriarchs period. We are in the desert. Now this gets a little bit confusing as part of the discussion because, as you'll see, remember I was talking about real estate, we're going to be concentrating on the land of Israel, even though, oh my, where happened to my, something happened to my screen. Oh, there it is. I don't know why. Okay, so even though we are in the desert still at this time, the story that we're going to be talking about, the discussion is going to focus on the land of Israel, which they haven't reached yet. They're hoping to reach it. They're looking for, well, some of them are looking forward to reaching it, right? We have the story with the spies. We'll be talking about that as well, where there's some concern amongst some of the Israelites about what it will be like to get to this land. But I think we'd like to hope that the Jewish people are in the desert looking forward to reaching the land of milk and honey. And when they get there, they will have been instructed already in their time in the desert as to where they're going to live. They're going to learn their neighborhoods or their regions. They are going to live according to tribe. Okay, and that's why I have the map here in front of you, the 12 tribes of Israel, and the locations. You don't have to worry about the individual cities or anything. I just want you to have a general idea of the sense of the division of the land of Israel into region according to tribes. It's something that I admit is very foreign to us today. We don't think about tribes. Perhaps, if we're of the tribe of Levi, we tend to think about it because the Leviim, the Levis, and the subset of Levis, the Kohanim, or the priests, still do have special roles in traditional synagogues today. But for the most part, the rest of us don't know our tribes and don't think about our tribal affiliations. So we have to put our mindset back in time to a biblical era before they've reached the land of Israel, but they're very much thinking about their identity in terms of tribes. In fact, they camp according to their tribes in the desert for those 40 years in the desert, and they're anticipating living among their own tribe once they reach the land of Israel. Okay, next slide. Terrific. I gave you tons of intro. Now it's finally time to get to the story. So I started off on verse number 2 because verse number 1, we already know that information. It lists the 5 sisters' names as well as their tribal affiliation. Okay, so we're introduced to our main characters, and now we're told that something very radical happens. Well, it doesn't say it's radical. You're going to have to trust me. It's going to radical. We'll talk about it more as we go along. They are the 5 women. Okay, 5 women, 5 sisters. They're not married, by the way. It's unclear their age, but they're unmarried. And we will see in a minute, they are orphans. Okay, perhaps their mother is still alive. It's unclear. It's actually not even told in the story. But from a biblical conception, I think even from a later rabbinic conception, if your father is not alive, then you're officially count as an orphan. Not as opposed to like in normal English language, we tend to think it's when both parents are not alive. But from a biblical sense, it would be true even when just the father has passed away. Okay, so the 5 sisters stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Okay, big deal. 5 sisters on their own, as we'll see, no one forced them, on their own regard, went to the place that was the seat of all power. Okay, obviously there's no differentiation between political power and religious power in those days. It's like saying, I don't know, that as if these 4 women, I'm not sure how young they are, but they eventually probably get married. So they're pre-marriageable age, they're orphans, and they go stand before Moses, who has a direct line to God, the head of the priests at that time, and the head of it's like in front of the whole government and the chief rabbi and all the main people. Imagine like the monumentalness of that. Not only anywhere, but at the entrance of the tent of meeting. That is the place, the Ohel Moed, where Moses goes to communicate directly with God. So it's equivalent to at the temple. And they then start the conversation. Okay, they go there because they want something, and they start the conversation. Our father died in the wilderness, they say. Okay, we know his name. It's Zelophelad. He was not one of the faction, Korach's faction, which banded together against the Lord, but died of his own sin, and he has left no sons. Now, we have learned a tremendous amount from this particular verse. We learn that he was not part of a larger group of people who rebelled against Moses and or rebelled against authority. Okay, that's what the reference here when it's talking about faction or Korach's faction. I'm not going to get into all the details of that right now. But those 40 years in the desert weren't exactly, a piece of cake for Moses. There were lots of times when the people complained, when they rebelled, when they built a golden calf. And those people were usually punished. And they were often punished by death. So what they, the 5 daughters, are saying here is that our father died for his own sin. It's not said here what it is. Again, there's tons of commentaries that try to explain what the sin was. Not going to get into that now. But he had his own sin. He wasn't part of a larger group of people who complained or incited. So they're trying to say he wasn't such a bad guy. And he wasn't great, maybe, but he wasn't such a bad guy. And he left no sons. We know there are 5 sisters. There could have been a son as well. They're making clear to us, no sons. Now, again, they're still in the desert, but anticipating what it's going to be like when they get into the land. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen or relatives. Okay, so a holding here I think the Hebrew word is achuzah, and it is a hereditary land holding. We're going to talk a lot about money and power and real estate, just like nowadays, that it's the real estate that very often is a way that is seen as a pretty good investment. And sometimes a lot of real estate can bring a lot of power and a lot of financial security. So too in those days. And we're going to be talking about this idea of who owns the land, the men or the women, and to whom can the land be passed down to, daughters or sons. Those of you who are with us in the last session of the first cycle we went through, we talked about women in ancient times owning land. And certainly the idea of land ownership existed for women in ancient Israel, as it did for many other ancient Near Eastern civilizations. Um, and that kind of change, we talked about it in other parts of the world. The big change was more like in the Middle Ages when some of those rights were taken away from women. But for our part here, the idea is that women had the ability to own land. That idea probably existed. The question is, could they inherit land? And what the inheritance means in terms of it, you're just owning it, or is there more behind it? That's the kind of the idea that I'm trying to build here in terms of think about what I told you about tribe and the place where the tribe is in the land of Israel. All of that is connected to. It's not just real estate that they want. It's not just an inheritance from their father. It's going to turn out to be a particular parcel of land that has so much more meaning to it. All right, so that's their request. And apparently, Moses, who at that time not only had religious leader, but also had judicial leader, had lawmaker, had everything, didn't have the answer for them as to whether or not they would receive that inheritance, and didn't laugh them off, and didn't push them away, and instead did something not unique, but almost unique in the time of the Bible. Can only think of one other time that this really happens in the first 5 books of Moses, where Moses actually turns to God about a particular legal situation and asks God what to do. That shows that this was important and that these women's voices and requests were taken very seriously. All right, so Moses goes and makes the plea to God, can these women inherit? And the Lord says to Moses, the plea of Zelophelad's daughters is just. Yes, yeah, you should listen to them and give them their father's inheritance. Um, and then it's spelled out in case you didn't know what he's talking about. You should give them a hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen, that the father's land is going to be amongst his other kinsmen, tribal relatives from the tribe of Manasseh. That's the tribe he's from. And it should be transferred, their father's share should be transferred to them. Like it should be real and legal and official. That's the end of their story. But now the story continues, the legality continues, and says, you know what? This is important for all other women in a similar situation as well. And it's quite radical. Further, speak to the Israelite people as follows. If a man dies without a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. If he has no daughter, though, now you have to think about all the legal contingencies. What if there isn't a daughter? You transfer it to his brothers. And there's like a further list of other relatives that I didn't bother keeping, citing for you here, but that I did cite the last sentence in this story where it says, this shall be the law of procedure for the Israelites in accordance with the Lord's command to Moses. Boy, that sounds official to me. And it really puts like a real stamp of official approvalness to this request. It is correct and right, and so correct and right that it shall now be the way moving forward for all times in a family that's in a similar situation. Now, I think actually I was going to, I was only going to tell the story to you quickly, and then I was going to give you more details here, but I gave you all the details, I think. that I wanted to tell you. But I wanted to think about this idea, and then I'm going to stop for the questions about this idea about land, as I hinted at in the beginning, that how the concept of land in ancient times, as well as to a certain extent in modern times as well, is very much bound up with the idea of money, with financial security, and also with identity. If you think about, certainly the concept of nationalism is a, pre-modern concept. It did not exist at the time. But in this case, what we're talking about is identity, tribal identity, and that the place where your land is, I think this is probably true in many cultures, probably in all cultures, how you are identified by the physical space that you're on, as well as by the people who are surrounding you and how they're related to, all the more so in a time before, modern countries and everything and modern political systems like we have nowadays. If you think to a tribal system, even I'm sure this is still true, where there still are tribal systems to a different degree, like even in modern days in Africa, etc., how where you live, your identity is so physically tied up with that. And if you're not allowed to live there, if you are not welcome there, wow, that's a huge blow to your identity, assuming you want your identity to be the same as the one with which you grew up. All right. I think this is a good time to pause. So I'm going to stop the share.
Oops.
And how do we want to, um,
I'm back.
let's see. Randy, you want to?
Yeah,
Okay.
I do. So there's a couple of questions.
Yeah.
A couple of them are kind of the same. Why was the land of Israel divided so unevenly among the tribes? And who made that decision? Because when you look at that map,
No, I know what you mean. I have to think about that. I have to admit, it's not really, that part of biblical history is not really my forte. And we have a whole book of Joshua that comes, right after the first 5 books of Moses, that entails all of the wars of conquering, that conquered those spaces. And there certainly were different times when different tribes, I think, were in the forefront of different battles. But it's not only that. We also do have the ones that are on the west side of the Jordan. That there are some, um, no, excuse me, not the west side, the east side, with directions, the east side of the Jordan. There are, when the people were settled there before they're moving into the land, apparently that land was very fertile and was comfortable for those particular tribes, and they petitioned to not make the actual final jump across the Jordan to be in the official promised land, and they were given permission to stay there, um, to stay there, assuming they promised to help with any military action that they would be needed for, to help their brethren on the west side of the Jordan. So, yeah, I think someone actually already answered part of the question, that about agricultural potential. I mean, that's the whole thing. I mean, anyone, of course, who has been to Israel, like, knows, like, some part is desert and some part is access to water and some doesn't. And so, just taking, mathematical numbering probably would not help, just like taking a ruler, let's say, and dividing it up. Plus, at that point, the tribes were different sizes already, just because of population and
right,
family growth and whatever.
right.
So I think that all of those things are probably part of it. And then probably part of it in terms of a belief issue, like, Joshua is still a prophet of God, and his military movements are believed in the book of Joshua to be, guided by God's hand. So part of that, God's plan probably figures into the picture as well.
Okay. And somebody else agreed with you and said that the tribes were of different numbers, and so
Yes,
that
that's
would make
right.
some
Some were
sense. Okay.
small and some were big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the other question, which is also interesting, and if those daughters married,
Yes.
would their land go to their husbands?
So we have part one of the story that I have shared with you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is often the only part of the story that is shared. If, there's a wonderful new genre of like children's books. I don't have one about the notes of God, but I think it exists already about like,
Oh,
powerful women in the Bible too, kind of thing. And there's so many amazing, amazing messages. As I said before, like there's the basic story that you could see like all these huge positives, and
mm-hmm.
hopefully I spelled them out for us like implicitly as I was, reading you the story and analyzing it as I went along. That all of those amazing positive messages are there. However, like I said in my intro,
Mm-hmm.
but it would have been impossible for you to figure out what I was talking about. But now you're starting to figure it out. Life can get messy sometimes. And just because you made a request for yourself, especially if we're talking about inheritances, which means that we're talking about things from one generation to the next, then that's when things can start to get messy. So, that in fact is an issue that was addressed a few chapters later in the Bible, and we are absolutely going to get there because it would be intellectually dishonest to skip it. But before we get there, though, I really want to, I'm going to put that on hold because I want to share with you an amazing piece from the Talmud that talks about how fantastic these women were. But we'll get there.
I only have one comment, which is they were five sisters. I
Yes.
mean, undoubtedly, they didn't always get along, right? I mean,
Oh, sisters?
undoubtedly,
Really?
really, yeah, really,
I have two who I love very much, by the way. Mom, are you there? You can attest to it.
I
She is
have
there
two
somewhere.
also, yes, so
Okay,
I
good.
get it. I also have three daughters, so there you go. Yeah. Okay, let's get going back,
Well, it
and
is
we'll.
wonderful in terms of that's also a beautiful story in terms of like how the five, I mean, you could go off on this. I don't think there's any actual classical midrashim on it, but I mean, as women, sisters reading the text, so interesting that the five of them are named as
Yeah.
individuals and yet that they all work together. So we see their individuality in that they're named, but we see they have a very unified motive and task and method in front of them. So that's a lovely message also in terms of sisterhood, to be an individual, but also to be part of a larger, to be part of a group and
Right.
to move forward together. Okay. So, someone else I see wants a copy of that timeline, my favorite timeline. Um, I'll have to, I'll get that at the end, okay? And then I'll put that in the tab. Unless, Anna, do you still have it? We had it for another time.
Later, there's no rush. You
Okay,
can do
that's
it
fine.
later. Later, there's no
That's
rush.
fine. No
After,
problem.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
one of my favorites.
yeah.
So it's so handy to see. All right, let's go back and we're going to learn some Talmud now, okay? Some Talmud, and then we're going to go back to the biblical story. I'm going to have to watch the time to make sure we cover everything as usual. Share screen. Here we go. This is what I wanted to. Oh, sorry. I introduced this idea about money and identity so much, tied up with the idea of land. But I want to put this idea in the back of our heads too. Does that mean power? Like, what does that mean in terms of, control and power, and who has that? That in a kind of a normal, here comes my, more feminism lens that I'm seeing things through, that the idea of the patriarchy in which they lived, where these kind of inheritance usually traveled from father to son, that does that mean that holding this land and or holding having the ability to do so? Was that a shift in power potentially between giving more power to these women who didn't normally have quite as much? And is that something that was upsetting to some, perhaps? Something to think about in the back of your mind. Now, this is the other thing to think about in terms of power. Here's our map again that we had before. And I just wanted to kind of point this out. The idea that tribal affiliation and identity, okay, this idea of identity I really want us to be thinking about, it's derived through the paternal line. Very interesting in biblical times, right? Nowadays, for the most part, in traditional Judaism at least, the Jewish identity is derived from the mother. And here we have a bit of a switcheroo from what we're usually thinking about. First of all, we're not thinking about national identity. We're thinking about tribal identity at this time. Tribal identity very much fixed on a piece of land, and land means security, financial and otherwise. And all of that is derived through the paternal line. And so really throwing a woman into this, or 5 women in this case, is perhaps a bit of a disruptor. All right, so when I told you this idea about power and that perhaps in a patriarchal system, that perhaps the daughters of Zelophelad are taking some power to themselves that doesn't normally belong there. You might think, I wouldn't blame you at all, if you think that the ancient rabbis would think that's a bad thing, okay? As it turns out, it's almost exclusively, actually I'm thinking about it, in all the midrashim I know about, seen as a positive. I want to share some of those rabbinic interpretations with you now. Okay, this is from a more extended portion from the Talmud. The Talmud has, lots of laws in it. I think everybody knows that. Lots of discussions between rabbis, arguments between rabbis, but also a lot of commentary in there also that really helps us understand biblical stories better. So this is part of an extended portion about different laws having to do with land inheritance. And in the middle of that legalistic discussion, there's a discussion about our daughters of Zelophelad. It starts out in a fabulous way, very unusual for the Talmud. I brought it for you in the Hebrew, for those of you that speak Hebrew, but we have the translation as well. But the Hebrew is fabulous. It says, Benot Zelophelad, the daughters of Zelophelad, are Chachmaniot hen, they are Chachmaniot, Darshaniot hen, and Tzidkaniot hen. I just have to pause also to tell or remind people the concept that Hebrew, of course, ancient, modern, everything is a gendered language, much like French, for instance, if you're familiar with it. So when a verb is used, it has a masculine or feminine ending, but the default is masculine, right? If you have a group of men and women together, the default conjugation of verbs, nouns, etc., is the masculine. And so probably not surprising that in a Talmud filled with rabbis having discussions with each other, that there's a lot of a masculine conjugation of verbs and even masculine endings for nouns. So anytime we see, more than one in a row, feminine kind of conjugation of, in this case, I guess they're nouns, gerunds or something. I don't forget the grammatical, what they're called. But the feminine ending, it already makes you kind of wake up a little bit because, it's a very masculine document. So here we have 3 incredibly positive attributes, descriptions given of these women, that they are wise, that they are interpreters. Now, interpreters here is not a good translation. It should actually say biblical interpreters or legal, like halachic interpreters, and they are righteous. These are not, you can see a wise woman, but the idea that a woman is like interpreting law and is righteous, you don't see that very often in the Talmud. So this really stands out as being incredibly special. Okay, this is positive. And then because it's so positive and unusual, we need an explanation of what the heck is going on here. So then the Talmud goes on to have list all these three characteristics and go ahead and explain them further, which is, I think, wonderful for us to read. So first of all, how do we know they're wise? In this case, the wisdom has to do with their knowledge of well, let's go. I'm just going to go ahead and read it. They spoke in accordance with the moment. There was a certain moment in time that they used to make their request, and that demonstrates their wisdom. Now, what was that moment in time? Well, as Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak says, tradition teaches, okay, this is not in the Torah itself, it's part of an oral tradition, that Moses, our teacher, was sitting and interpreting in the Torah portion. Now, okay, we don't have any demonstration in the Torah itself that Moses sat around and studied Torah. However, for the rabbis of the Talmud, who for them, the, most important thing to do was to sit around and study Torah, of course that Moses, in his ample free time in the desert, would also sit around and study Torah. So apparently that's how they envisioned Moses at that time. And at that time, he was studying the passage in the Torah that we see later on in Devarim. Now, don't ask me how he knew about a later law from Deuteronomy when we're only in the book of Numbers now, but that it was all oral and he was all brought down to him on Mount Sinai, let's put it that way. And he was sitting and he was learning the halacha, the laws about this very unusual situation, which those of us who were with me in the last few weeks are all experts on, the concept of levirate marriage, or yibum in Hebrew, the concept of if two brothers die and one brother dies, he doesn't leave a son, then his widow is supposed to marry his the surviving brother in order to have a son with him, but the son will count as if he belongs to the first brothers. It belongs to the first brother, so he will establish the first brother's name, but also will be entitled to that first brother's inheritance. So it's a very complex law. As a matter of fact, there's an entire book in the Talmud that is dedicated to the intricacies of it. But apparently Moses was sitting and discussing it, and they listened in. These daughters of Zelophelad were so smart that they were listening in to this halachic discussion. And they said, if we are considered like a son, give us inheritance like a son. If not, like as we requested. But if not, if you're not going to let us, this is, I guess, would have happened before Moses and asked God what to do. If not, our mother should enter into this type of levirate marriage. Or, if you're not going to count us for anything, then make our mother, marry again. I have no idea how old the poor woman is at this point. Make her have a son with our uncle, and then that son will go ahead and inherit the land that we're requesting. Sounds kind of crazy, but also demonstrates their incredible knowledge of the intricacies of halacha, of Jewish law, and their ability to use logic in such a way to demonstrate that their request is valid and appropriate. And immediately upon hearing their claim, the verse records, and Moses brought their cause before the Lord, and in that case, God decided with them. So that's a demonstration of how smart these women were. Now, how we want to learn how they are interpreters of Torah themselves. Okay, they are Torah interpreters. They don't have to bother listening to that halachic discussion that Moses was having, but they have a knowledge of the laws of inheritance already, the ones that already exist in their times. And they say, if he had had a son, they're referring to their father, of course, we would not have spoken. They're like, it's not like we're being these uppity women that want stuff. We know the law, okay? We're respecting the law. to a certain extent. And we know that if we had a brother, that he would have gotten this inheritance. We would have just, we would have known our space, and we would have placed, and we would have kept quiet. Even if there was a daughter of his son, we would not have spoken. So in this case, what they're referencing is, what if we had had a brother who is now dead? Okay, this is all what ifs. If the brother was now dead and he didn't have a son, but he had a daughter, okay? So if we had a surviving niece from a brother who was not alive, all ifs, we would not have spoken because she would have been the rightful heir. Because the idea is we wouldn't have stepped in to the place of our brother, even if he was dead, and even if he'd only left a daughter, that in those cases, we know our place. We wouldn't have spoken up. We're not just being uppity women. We know the law. We're demonstrating that we know the law, that we, by explaining this situation, and that we would not have spoken up in those cases. So according to this midrash, then that shows that they are legal interpreters, that they know the law, seen definitely as a very positive. And the last was that they're righteous because they did not rush to marry, but rather waited to marry those fit for them. So first of all, didn't rush to marry. These women were already of marriageable age, and they didn't. This case would have been far more complicated if they had married, as someone has already anticipated. And so they did not marry yet, basically until the issue was solved. Okay, so they are being righteous in that case, and they are holding themselves back in order to make sure that they participate in doing the right thing and the righteous thing. And they are waiting until they see who is fit for them. We'll see what that means, based on, I guess, they're waiting to see what the conclusion of the legal case that they were bringing to Moses would be. So in order to decide who would be fit for them, basically involves tribal affiliation, as you can probably see based on how the discussion is going. But anyway, they're seen as incredibly positive. Now, part two, as we've already hinted at, the story does not end in Numbers chapter 27. We need to get to Numbers chapter 36. Okay, we don't hear about them again. We think, oh, that's the end of their story. Isn't that beautiful? Until the family heads and the clans of the descendants of Gilad, son of Machir, son of Manasseh. Okay, this is the important thing. It is the tribe of Manasseh or Menashe, one of the Josephite clans. Remember, Ephraim and Manasseh are the sons of Joseph, came forward. So basically, the head honchos, the main family heads in the tribe of Manasseh, came forward and appealed to Moses and the chieftains, family heads of the Israelites. So they are now launching a legal appeal to the law made by God, by the way. So it's pretty audacious that they do this also. Very interesting, how we'll see from them how important the idea of land and identity, like we've been talking about, is tied up with this idea of inheritance. They said, the Lord commanded my Lord Moses to assign the land to the Israelites as shares by lot. This is the other thing. You see, this is where the divine part comes in also. People said, how did the land get divided up? So God commanded also that there was some amount of arbitrariness to this land allocation as well. And my Lord was further commanded by the Lord to assign the share of our kinsman Zelophelad to his daughter. So not only was the tribe allocated by whole tribe, but even within tribe there were smaller clans and families, and even that was determined by Moses and all these other methods, starting in the desert, continuing on with Joshua. So there's not only was there an idea that Zelophelad was going to live in that swath of land that belonged to the tribe of Manasseh, even within that swath of land, there is a particular place that's for him and his descendants. So now, if they marry persons from another Israelite tribe, their share will be cut off from our ancestral portion. Okay, remember, we're talking here about inheritances, so we're never only thinking about this generation. We're thinking about the next generation and the next generation, because this inheritance is only ours temporarily until it goes on to be inherited by our descendants. So it will be added to the portion of the tribe into which they marry. As we said before, tribal affiliation and land tribal affiliation goes by the father, right? We said paternal. So the idea is if they marry into another tribe, their little piece of land from Manasseh will now belong to someone from a different tribe. And that will be, it's one thing to blend bloodlines of tribes, but you can't blend pieces of land. Land, not an immovable um, thing. So what would it mean? Like, oh, here's the tribe of Manasseh with just like a tiny bit of the tribe of Judah in it. Like, that doesn't work. It would, in fact, not only doesn't it work, thus our allotted portion will be diminished. We'll end up having less of the tribe of Manasseh, and their share will be cut off from the ancestral portion of our tribe. I want to think about that last line for us for a minute in conjunction with what we've been talking about. When they said, thus our allotted portion will be diminished, right? This is what the other elders of the tribe of Manasseh are saying, is basically, you've given us X amount of land for as Manasseh. But if they marry someone from another tribe, that means that their children will be of the other tribe and that they will inherit the land. So like I said, it'll be like a little piece of Judah in the middle of all of Manasseh, which would mean that our Manasseh X is now X minus 1 will be diminished. We'll have less land for Manasseh as a whole. So it would be a loss of money for us as a tribe. And also, there's going to be a loss of identity, or there's going to be a confusion of identity because their share will be cut off from the ancestral portion of our tribe. Our tribe has this wonderful, unified, like all the other tribes, a wonderful, unified chunk of land. And now you're threatening to chunk it up into smaller pieces or perhaps pollute it with someone else from another tribe. That's going to affect our tribal identity. And this might be making these leaders nervous because this sounds like that their ultimate power over how the tribe should be run and how the tribal identity should look and seem and be worth is perhaps going to be diminished or even lost. So Moses decides, with God's agreement, that in fact they're right. Okay. So the question is, oh my goodness, what happened to the amazing fight of the daughters of Zelophelad? Does it all get erased? 9 chapters later, is it all gone? Like, did I tell you the story and get you all excited, and now I dashed you down? Okay, let's put that on hold. Let's see the details, and then we can decide. This is what the Lord has commanded concerning the daughters of Zelophelad. They may marry anyone they wish, provided they marry into a clan of their father's tribe. Okay, so they have choice when it comes to marriage, but now if they want to inherit that land, they're going to need to marry within the tribe, because no inheritance of the Israelites may pass over from one tribe to another. The Israelites must remain bound into each of the ancestral portion of his tribe. So this is not only true, it's not like a punishment for the daughters of Zelophelad. It would be any time now there's a discussion of a woman marrying a man of another tribe. If that woman has land that she has inherited, what happens to that land? Okay. It's not only them, the problem would then exist for all other similar situations. Every daughter among the Israelite tribes who inherits a share must marry someone from a clan of her father's tribe in order that every Israelite may keep his ancestral share. Thus, no inheritance shall pass over from one tribe to another. The idea is we have to keep things within borders, which of course is not so much of a surprise to us in terms of how ancient Israel or even rabbinic Israel works. They like categories of things, and they don't necessarily like, the milchiks and the fleishiks or the chametz and the non-chametz to get mixed up together. So too with the tribes. And the daughters of Zelophelad agreed to do as Moses commanded. They're named here again, okay, which is seen by all the rabbis also as showing that they are very special and that they merit to be remembered, and they merit to be associated with this very positive interaction in the Bible where they saw that there was an unjust law and that they pursued justice in the appropriate way. And then they agreed to the emendation that was necessary at the end, necessary for the society in which they lived. And they agreed to marry, within their tribe. So some people might not like that idea because it makes it sound like forced marriage. So just as an aside to remind people that, of course, before modern times, or even in modern times in certain cultures today, that the idea of, just going on Tinder or somewhere on the internet and finding anyone who you want to marry wasn't always the way. There were very often very strict expectations slash rules about who people were supposed to marry. So if that was the case in biblical times, we shouldn't be too surprised. But just, it's a lovely other piece in the Talmud that tells us here that um, in fact they actually, if they did fall in love or whatever, wanted to marry someone outside of their tribe, that they were allowed to, because of a close reading of, I'm not going to take the time right now, but a close reading of the particular wording of how those phrases are in that chapter in the book of Numbers that we just read. In chapter 36 of the book of Numbers, it says that it's not like they must marry those men, but rather it's giving them good advice to do so. So if they don't want to forfeit their land inheritance, they should marry within the tribe. But in fact, it's not a law, it's only advice. So if they want to marry others, that in fact they would be permitted to do so. So it says something lovely for freedom there. And I had a whole other bunch of stuff that I wanted to share with you about how they're seen as amazing proto-Zionists, because I'm not going to share it with you now, but the idea that these daughters of Zelophelad, in addition to other women based on different understandings of different midrashim, that they are considered, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. That they are so wrapped up in their excitement of landing in the land of Israel, rather than complaining and saying that they like it better in the desert, I'd rather go back to Egypt, that there's a bit of a theme there of these women and others, that they are being optimistic, looking ahead to the future, and so excited about leaving behind Egypt and the desert, and in fact making their way as with their identities, with their nation in the land of Israel. Okay, so that is us for today. And I think that I wrote something. I did. I'm going to change in the chat. The Insta Omer, I spelled it wrong. So I will fix that up. And
Just found it.
oh, you found it? Okay,
Yeah, I
good.
found it under
Insta. I did it wrong. Insta Omer 2020. Okay.
Okay.
And the other can do the timeline too. But in the meantime, does anyone have any questions?
Somebody asked the question.
Yes, please.
Jill, does it matter, or what's the significance? Is there significance? But the names of the daughters are in a different order. The second.
Yes. Excellent close reading, just like the ancient rabbis had a very close reading in that way as well. And they noticed that. And it's actually part of that message that I said before about, individuals but together. The idea is to demonstrate that there was, even though one of them, I forget how, was demonstrated to be the oldest and one is the youngest. I forget which order it is, the first time it's cited or the second time it's cited, but either way, it's flipped, and it's in order to demonstrate that they were all equal to each other, that no one was better than the other, which is also like a nice, lovely message in terms of sisterhood, like we were talking about before. So yes, that's the kind of close reading that that Midrash is all about. To notice something you might think, oh, well, that's not important. It's just a list, but very often it's an opportunity to learn something new.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments at this point before we close out for today?
And just as you're talking, I'm just on my phone looking for that other citation for sorry about
I had
that.
a quick question. In one of the,
Yeah, please.
it's Beverly. In one of the comments, you said, and the Lord said to the Lord to
Oh,
do
that's the
something.
capital and the lowercase. So that was
Yeah.
the Lord capital was God spoke to Moses, because the idea is there, which that does happen. I forget the exact Hebrew of it there,
Okay.
but it's from the context. It is clear even in the Hebrew
Right.
that it's God speaking to Moses there, and it's so interesting about how both of them are involved in the legalities
Right.
of this particular episode, because very often it would be something that Moses and the elders would be able to take care of on their own, and this was considered important enough to bring to God, and then God deemed it important enough to listen and to rule in their favor.
Okay. All right. So one Lord was God, and the small Lord was
Yes,
Moses.
yes, the lowercase in the English
Lowercase
was Moses in that
Perfect.
case.
Thank you.
Even though we don't have lower cases in Hebrew. So in Hebrew, we just know it from the context.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
This is a question for Anna Ginden. Anna, is there a recording of the last one about Miriam?
There
Is that-
is. I'm just looking for the link. So
Okay.
if I can't find the link, I will post it. But you know what? I can just send everybody an email with.
But most often they're on the Adath Israel
Yes, they're always on the Adath Israel YouTube page, YouTube channel, I guess I should say. It should be there. It's definitely a recording, and if we omitted to put it up, then it will go up, and I'll send everybody the links.
And now there's another question.
Perfect.
Robin is asking, was the rule for all women that inherit that they marry within their tribe to pass on their inheritance?
Yes. And
Yes,
so the
yeah.
idea is there was actually a discussion in the Talmud that was very legalistic that I didn't, bring to you about whether or not that rule, how long that rule stayed for. It's interesting. We're talking about generations and moving from generation to generation in terms of inheritance. And truth be told, like there weren't at a certain point, certainly at a certain point in history, it didn't become important at all, because after, I would say, probably the Assyrian conquest, which is in 722 BCE, we have the dispersion of the first 10 tribes. So tribal affiliation does not become important at all anymore by then. And even before that, I think it was clear that they were not necessarily following all of the rules about the tribal affiliations, with the exception, of course, as I said, the very special circumstance of the tribe of Levi and the subsection there of the Kohanim, but those ones would not be land-related rules because they didn't have their own land, because they were supported by the temple.
Right.
And their workings in the temple. So it's kind of like a bit of a snapshot in time that this is such an important discussion that did not continue later on. That being said, the idea of inheritance to daughters when appropriate, and that idea did continue in Judaism. Women could continue to inherit land, which again is certainly not true in every culture. And that would be land, not the specific land, that's just land in general real estate.
So for anybody who's looking, Anna Ginden, has now posted the link to the last lecture.
Yes,
you can
and I'm
find
just
that.
typing in
That's on
the,
YouTube.
I'm typing in
And
the
yeah,
time, that very cool timeline, because I very much recommend it. Because as I said, the pop-ups are distracting for when I'm teaching, but if you're looking at it on your own, you can like play around with it and see, like, because it even correlates like Jewish history with other major history events, like what was going on at the same time
I love
in other
those
parts
things.
of
Great.
history.
Yeah.
And you know, or famous people, pieces of literature, and it's just nice to have it all on one screen, because very often, you know, it's very easy to forget, you know, what came first and what came last, because traditionally we tend to lump it all together. But if you're looking at things from a historical perspective, like I tend to do, it's very handy to keep things all in line.
okay.
Right?
Any more? Going once, twice? All right. Thank you, Anna, so
Okay.
much. Once
Thank
again,
you.
very
Pleasure.
fascinating. And I'm sure that there will be lots of discussion following this.
Yay. I love that. And anytime,
please-
by the way, people that I see, now that I said I wanted to see everyone's face, and now that I see people's face, I can't do anything about it because I'm busy doing the teaching. So hi, everyone who I'm not seeing. I'm not talking to directly, but if I see you, thank you for coming. Even if I don't see you, thank you for coming. Is next week, is next time one of our, are we meeting? I know there's 1 week that we're skipping, so I just want to make sure that we're clear to
April
everyone.
7th is our next lecture date.
which
So
is
it is
next
right away
week.
next time.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, that's next week.
Oh,
All right. So hopefully we'll
yeah,
see you all next week.
I look forward to
Thank you so
it.
much.
Okay.
And have a wonderful Pesach and enjoy the rest of. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry, Randy. I just
That's
wanted
okay.
to, I know a few of you had a hard time getting in. That just means you haven't registered for the new series. So if you aren't receiving the links, if you can just go on our website and re-register, and this way I'll make sure that I send you the link before the
Do the
post.
links come out weekly or they're just all in one email?
It's actually, it's always the same link for all 6
Okay.
programs, but if you haven't received the link from me, it means that you haven't registered for this this session.
Sorry, I'm just making
Perfect.
faces to
Thank you.
people I know. Also, but Anna, just even for my own sake, it was wonderful to receive the reminder email today.
Yeah.
And I know for other people I've spoken to, even
didn't-
if it's the same link, it's still a lovely reminder, like, oh, it's Wednesday.
No, it's
we tend
definitely
to forget, and you know, and it's this afternoon, and here's the link. Kind of
I
thing.
didn't
no,
receive a reminder.
there's definitely going to be an email sent out as a
Okay,
reminder.
good.
But
Okay, good.
for those of you that have emailed me and said you haven't received my reminders, that's because
Okay.
you haven't signed up.
Okay.
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 Well, I look forward to seeing you and anybody else next time, and enjoy the rest of Pesach. Enjoy the
Excuse
rest
me?
of Pesach.
Thank you to everybody.
Anna, it's Gail Kaufman. I didn't receive a reminder email today.
That's
I
the
did
other
get mixed up on the days. That was why I signed in late, but I did register.
Okay.
So
All right. I
if
will
you don't mind-
maybe if you enter your email wrong, then I'm sending it to the wrong email.
I don't,
No.
it automatically enters.
No, I don't.
All right. We'll leave that for the two of you to
I'll
share. And the
register
rest of
again.
us.
Technology.
The rest of us
Well,
will
if you
say
have
goodbye.
the link, it works next time too. So put in your own
Okay.
calendar,
I will
and
do.
I'll
Bye,
try to
everybody.
remember it. You try to remember it,
and
and I'll see y'all
hopefully-
next time.
And hopefully with the holidays, I don't get the days of the week all mixed up.
Well, we do. That's why the reminders are
Yeah.
we all do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Thank you, Anna.
everybody.
Thank you, Randy.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.